Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I have a very exciting video for you all. Today I am more than delighted to announce the coming of Victober. So, if you don't know, Victober, or Victorian October, is a month-long read-along that takes place every year in October, where me and a few other booktubers encourage you to use the month of October to read Victorian literature. This will be the third year that we've done Victober, and I have absolutely loved it every year so far. It's been such a complete joy for me to take part in and to host and to read a lot of Victorian literature in a month. For the purposes of the readathon, I would count Victorian literature as British or Irish literature from between 1837 to 1901. It's one of my favourite time periods in literature. In fact, I find the whole of the Victorian period in Britain just like such an interesting, fascinating part of history in terms of the society of at the time, the culture of the time, the sort of changes in economy and politics. Like, it's such an interesting period and it produced so many amazing books. So there are three other booktubers who are joining me to host Victober. We have Ange from Beyond the Pages, Kate Howe and Lucy the Reader. They all have amazing channels and they all love Victorian literature and sort of classics as a whole, so please do check out their channels, and there will be plenty of recommendations on their announcement videos, which should be up at the same time as mine as well. So, in order to take part in Victober, all you have to do is read some Victorian literature in October. That's all you have to do to be a part of this. But we do have 5 challenges for those of you that would like to make things a little bit trickier. We have picked one challenge out each, and then we have one sort of general challenge. So today I will be letting you know all of the challenges and giving you some recommendations for my challenge and the group challenge. And then for recommendations on Ange's challenge, Kate's and Lucy's, you need to head over to their channels, which will be linked down in the description. So, our 5 challenges. Ange's challenge is to read a book by one of the host's favourite Victorian authors. So Lucy's is Charlotte Brontë, mine is Charles Dickens, Kate's is Elizabeth Gaskell, and Ange's is Thomas Hardy. So you need to read a book by one of those 4 authors. Kate's challenge is to read a Victorian book with a proper noun in the title, so a book that has a person's name or a place name in the title. My challenge is to read a book from the first 10 years of the Victorian period and or a book from the last 10 years of the Victorian period. Lucy's challenge is to read a book written by a woman anonymously or under a pseudonym. And our general group challenge is to read a Victorian book and then watch a screen adaptation of it. And then along with those 5 challenges, we're also going to be hosting a read-along this year, and that is going to be a read-along of Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. We asked people on Twitter and Goodreads which of a few particular authors they would like to try out, and people voted for Elizabeth Gaskell, so we decided on Wives and Daughters, which is a absolutely incredible book. It follows a young girl called Molly and what happens when her father one day decides to remarry and a new stepmother and stepsister come into her life, and so many other glorious things happen. It's really beautiful, I would say really accessible and enjoyable, and yeah, I love it an awful lot. I can't wait to reread it again, even though I only reread it last year, because that's how good it is. We will be running this read-along and having a lot of other Victober chat on the Victober Goodreads group, which I'm going to link down below, so please do go and join if you're not already a member. There will be plenty of discussion threads there on the group read-along, and also on sort of what people are planning to read on their TBR, what people are currently reading during Victober, if they're enjoying it, and so on, and general discussions about Victorian literature, so please do go and join that. And also, if you want to sort of take part in Victober on Twitter and Instagram, use the hashtag Victober, and we will find you. So now, moving on to some recommendations for my challenge. My challenge, as I have already said, is to read a book from the first 10 years of the Victorian period and or the last 10 years of the Victorian period. The reason I kind of decided on this challenge is that we often think of the Victorian period as this one sort of big homogeneous time period. We think of it as one thing, whereas actually the Victorian period spanned like 64 years, quite a lot of change took place over that time period. A huge amount of social and economic and technological change. Like 64 years ago from today, it was 1954. If you consider how society and life as a whole has changed in the last 64 years, and obviously the rate of change has been pretty huge in the last 64 years, but it was also pretty huge over the Victorian period, though possibly not quite as huge as today. And so I do think it's really interesting to look at how different life was at the beginning of the Victorian period in comparison to the end of the Victorian period, and to look at the difference between books from the very early Victorian period and the very late Victorian period, because they are quite different. This is an and/or challenge. You complete the challenge if you read a book from the first 10 years of the Victorian period or the last 10 years of the Victorian period, although I would recommend that if you have read more early Victorian books previously, try and pick one from the end, and if you have read more late Victorian books previously, try and pick one from the beginning. But if you want extra bonus challenge points which don't count for anything but can make you feel satisfied as a reader, then feel free to read one from the beginning of the Victorian period and the very end, which is what I'm hoping to be doing. So a few books or authors that I would recommend for the first 10 years of the Victorian period, 1837 to 1847. Well, I wouldn't go through a video about the Victorians without mentioning Dickens now, would I? Quite a few of Dickens's novels were written in the first 10 years of the Victorian period. We have the Pickwick Papers, we have Oliver Twist, we have Nicholas Nickleby, and also the Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge and Martin Chuzzlewit were all written in the first 10 years of the Victorian period. It was a very productive 10 years for Charles Dickens. Of those 6, I would especially recommend Martin Chuzzlewit, which is a book I really, really love, and a really, really interesting one following a young man called Martin Chuzzlewit and also his grandfather and all the complicated family relationships in the Chuzzlewit family. And there's also Benjamin Disraeli, who has a few books from the first 10 years of the Victorian period. One is Sybil, or The Two Nations, which I have read and really enjoyed. It's an industrial novel looking at the kind of social and political and economic changes going on in the 1830s and 1840s and how that affects Victorian life. And then just sneaking into this challenge from the year 1847, we have 3 books by the Brontes: Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Agnes Grey is a lovely, moving story about a young woman forced to go out as a governess. Jane Eyre is a story also about a governess who falls in love with a man whose ward she is looking after. And Wuthering Heights is a crazy, glorious, beautiful, gothic mess of a novel that I adore so much and is one of my favourite books of all time. Then 2 other books I wanted to mention from the very early Victorian period. One is a Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy by Francis Trollope, which is another industrial novel. Now, I haven't read this yet. This was on my TBR for VICTOBER last year and I didn't manage to get to it, so I'm hoping to get to it this year. Francis Trollope was Anthony Trollope's mother, so if you're a fan of Anthony Trollope, maybe you would like to try out something by his mother. Or if you are simply a fan of the Victorian industrial novel and have enjoyed books like North and South, then Michael Armstrong might be for you. And then another early Victorian read might be Zoe, The History of Two Lives by Geraldine Dewsbury. This was another one actually, which was on my VICTOBER TBR for last year and I didn't get to, but one I would really love to read. I have read Geraldine Dewsbury's The Half-Sisters, which is a little bit later, and absolutely adored it, and I'm just so excited to read more by her. She's such a brilliant writer. And then a few recommendations for the last 10 years of the Victorian period. Maybe you feel like picking up something by Joseph Conrad, who's a very interesting Polish-British writer who writes quite a lot about empire abroad. The only thing I've read by him is The Heart of Darkness, which I studied at university. It's from 1899 and looks at the role of the Belgian Empire in the Congo. Another author who writes quite a lot about empire in the late Victorian period is Rudyard Kipling. There is his novel The Jungle Book from 1894, from which the classic Disney film comes, partly though. They're quite different. If you read The Jungle Book, do not be expecting Disney. It's really, really not that. But very interesting still to read. There is also another of his most famous novels, Kim, which is from 1901 and set in India, and one that I would certainly like to read. Or perhaps you feel like picking up some plays instead for this challenge and reading some plays by George Bernard Shaw. A lot of George Bernard Shaw's very early plays are from the 1890s. I have read and absolutely loved Mrs. Warren's Professions. It's such an interesting play in terms of looking at gender roles, and like, I mean, if you read Mrs. Warren's Profession, it feels so much closer in many ways to like a book from the 1920s than it does to like Oliver Twist. Like, it feels like a really, really different world that he's writing about. I'd also be interested in reading Widowers' Houses or The Philanderer or Arms and the Man or Candida or You Never Can Tell. All of these plays are for the last 10 years of the Victorian period. It was a productive time for George Bernard Shaw and he is such an interesting playwright. Perhaps you want to read Dracula by Bram Stoker from 1897. Not my favourite Victorian book by a very, very long stretch, but certainly one that a lot of people love. It's gothic, it's dramatic, it's supernatural and a fun read. Maybe you want to read A Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde or some of his 1890s plays, such as Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, The Importance of Being Earnest, or An Ideal Husband. Oscar Wilde is a brilliant writer, witty, satirical, very dark in places, but also unfailingly funny and enjoyable to read. Or maybe if you enjoy science fiction, you would like to pick up some H.G. Wells, who is the founder of science fiction in many ways. I've read and enjoyed quite a few of his science fiction works from the 1890s, including The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, and The Time Machine. And there's also one of his non-science fiction books from the last 10 years of the Victorian period, which is Love and Mr. Lewisham. Obviously, H.G. Wells is incredibly well remembered today as being sort of one of the founding fathers of science fiction, but we do tend to forget that he also wrote quite a lot of interesting social critique novels in a kind of Dickensian vein, which I really enjoy. Or maybe you would like to try your hand at some George Gissing. I warn you, he is miserable, but he is also absolutely brilliant. His novel New Grub Street was published in 1891 and looks at the role and sort of social position of novelists in the Victorian period. It's absolutely fantastic. And then there is The Odd Women from 1893, which is my favourite George Gissing and one of my favourite Victorian books. It's about women's changing social position in the Victorian period. It's about feminism and women choosing not to marry or building lives that don't revolve around marriage and men. And it's a strong critique against the Victorian idea of separate spheres, and it's awesome. It's so good. It's so great. Or maybe you would like to read some Thomas Hardy, who also has a few novels from the 1890s, as miserable as George Gissing, but just as incredible. There is Tess of the D'Urbervilles from 1891, which examines the position of a fallen woman within Victorian society, or there is Jude the Obscure from 1895, which is my favourite Hardy, and looks at a young man's struggles with sort of being an outcast from society, being intelligent, wanting to go to university but not being able to because of his social class, getting tied up in complicated relationships, and it's beautiful. It's heartbreaking, but it's beautiful. And if that was not quite enough recommendations for you, I'm also going to link down below a few pages on victorianweb.org, the website on which I spent the majority of my teenage years because I was very cool. They have 2 pages on that where they list the bestsellers of the Victorian period, so you can have a look at the first 10 years and the last 10 years of the Victorian period and see what the bestsellers were in every year. Now, recommendations for the general challenge: to read a Victorian book and watch a screen adaptation of it. So obviously I love Victorian literature, but another thing I really love is screen adaptations of Victorian literature. The bulk of my teenage years, when I wasn't spending time on victorianweb.org, was spent watching TV adaptations of 19th century novels and then reading those 19th century novels, yes, mostly in that order. I made a video last Victober actually talking about some of my favourite screen adaptations, so I will link that down below to give you even more recommendations, and you should also definitely go and watch Lucy, Kate's and Ange's videos, in which they will be giving some of their favourite Victorian novels and screen adaptation pairs. First, let's mention my favourite novel ever, Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, and the 1998 screen adaptation of it, which is absolutely brilliant. This is an amazing book set in Victorian London, following what happens when a young man who is due to inherit a large fortune dies on his way back into England, and this adaptation is just absolutely amazing. It's beautifully done, it's so well acted, and I love it a lot. And David Morrissey as Bradley Headstone is perfection. Talking of perfection, this is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, my second favourite ever book, and this is its TV adaptation from 2004, which is the best thing that's ever been on any screen ever. This is an industrial novel which I like to fondly refer to as Pride and Prejudice with Mills, or Pride and Prejudice with social criticism. It's brilliant, it's amazing, and the BBC adaptation is just, it's just incredible. I have no words for how amazing this is. I also couldn't not mention the 2006 adaptation of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë is another Victorian favourite of mine, following the life of Jane Eyre, going off to be a governess, falling slightly in love with the man she works for. This adaptation is incredible. There is a later film which I don't like nearly so much, because this, for me, like Ruth Wilson and Toby Stevenson are Jane and Rochester. I think it's perfect. Like, this is the first adaptation of a 19th century novel I ever saw, and it made me read Jane Eyre, which was the first Victorian book I ever read. This is responsible for me getting into Victorian literature. I feel like that should tell you enough about how good it is. I then also wanted to mention Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, and this amazing television film from 1998. There is a more recent film with Carey Mulligan which I really enjoyed, but this is my favourite one, and partly I think just because it's a bit longer and it just gives you that little bit more time to get to grips with the story. Far From the Madding Crowd follows a young woman called Bathsheba Everdeen who inherits a farm, and it looks at the struggles of being a woman running a farm in the 19th century, and also the various suitors who are kind of vie for her hand. The book is amazing and this adaptation is brilliant. So those are all of my recommendations, but please do go over to Ange, Lucy and Kate's videos to see what they would recommend for their challenges and for the general challenge. Now, quickly before I go, I did want to mention a couple of upcoming video plans, ideas that I have for Victober. To begin with, I'm going to be vlogging the whole of Victober, which I have not done before for Victober, but I did do for Jane Austen back in July, obviously, and really enjoyed it. It was really fun to vlog my reading and do kind of a weekly vlog update. So I'm definitely going to be doing that for Victober, which I'm really looking forward to. And then in terms of a few individual videos, I'm hoping to do a video on Victorian books that I have not enjoyed, because that was requested earlier on in the year. I'm also looking forward to doing a video on my favourite Victorian authors, as I've done one before on my favourite Victorian books, but not specifically on my favourite Victorian authors. I'm also hoping to do a video on disability in Victorian literature, which will be in a kind of similar format to my video last year on LGBTQ+ themes in Victorian literature. And I'm also hoping to finally start my new Victorian video series that I mentioned quite a while ago now I was going to start, which is going to be something along the lines of 5 Victorian books about, and then different words in the different videos. So I might do, for example, 5 Victorian books about respectability, 5 Victorian books about science, 5 Victorian books with Gothic elements, or 5 Victorian books with great mysteries, something like that. I haven't decided yet which things I'm going to pick for Victober, but I'm definitely going to be starting that series. So if you have any suggestions or any particular themes or genres within Victorian literature that you would like recommendations for, please do let me know in the comments and I will have a think. Another video I'd like to do in Victober is one about sort of reading and encountering problematic elements in Victorian literature. Ages ago, when I reviewed The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber, someone asked me in the comments whether I was more forgiving of problematic things in classics than I am in modern books, and I definitely am, and I wanted to make a video talking about that and why. I'm also hoping to make a booktuber shout-out video talking about great booktubers who read Victorian literature. I was going to do this last year and kind of replaced it with a collaborative video, but I would quite like still to do a shout-out recommending people for you to watch if you like Victorian literature, because there are a lot of us on BookTube who talk about Victorian literature. Me and the other 3 hosts are also hoping to do a live show at some point in Victober, but more on that anon. I think that is all I have to say. I'm sure this has been quite a long video, but I did have a lot to discuss and to recommend and to chat about. I'm so excited for Victober. Please do go and join the Goodreads group down below if you'd like to take part, and please do go and watch the other hosts' announcement and recommendation videos as well. So please let me know down in the comments if you're hoping to take part in Victober, and also let me know if you have any video requests or ideas or things you would like me to discuss in the month of Victober. I am very excited. It's been a very un-Victorian year for me. I think I've read like 10 Victorian books this year maybe, and by this point last year I'd read like 50 Victorian books in 2017. I've been feeling the absence of the Victorians in my reading life, and I'm really looking forward to Victober to come and fill my life with Victorian splendour. So yes. Right. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know your thoughts, and if you're going to join in down in the comments, I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.